All right. Thank you for joining me in this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great one for you today. I'm excited for this one. I have Chantel Monique Duson with me, and we're going to be talking about some critical race theory and how it interacts with the Black community. So I thank you for joining me. As always, I do want to go ahead and ask you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Hit that subscribe button. Make sure you do that so you can stay in the loop with The Gospel Truth that's going on, so you will not be out the loop. We have a whole bunch of things going on with The Gospel Truth, and I want you to stay with us. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you can be notified. If you don't know, all this content is not only on Facebook and YouTube, but also on Instagram and Twitter. So make sure that you are hitting that subscribe button over those platforms as well, so you can stay with us there as well. Also, all this content is on podcast. If you only like the audio, you have your option to go to the podcast. It's iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. So make sure you're subscribing there. And while you're there, please leave a good rating as well, so we can get this podcast popular. I need your help to do that. Please do that. And as always, I do have a bunch of shows coming up that I want to go over. All right, coming up Tuesday, May 4th, I have a debate. It's Human Reasoning Autonomous. It's coming up 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. After that is Justification Included in the Gospel. I have Chris Brian Samuel versus Ricky Caldwell, Saturday, May 8th at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. After that, Oneness or Trinity, the biblical view of God. That's coming up Monday, May 10th at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then lastly, after that is Universalism True, A.K. Richardson versus West Fallen Camp, I think I pronounced it right, Friday, May 14th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is just the next 4 shows coming up here on The Gospel Truth. Once again, make sure that you're liking, make sure you're subscribing, making sure that you are staying in the loop. But everything The Gospel Truth has going on, you don't want to miss out on any shows. It's going to be great. All right, so we have, like I said, we have an exciting show today, and it's going to be exciting. I keep saying exciting because it is exciting, and it's going to be a great show. I have Chantel Monique Duson with me, and we're going to be talking about some critical race theory and how it interacts with the Black community. This is something that's important to me, and I got Monique because I know it's important to her, and we're going to have a great conversation. But before I bring her in, let me introduce her. Chantel Monique Duson has a background in social service and children's ministry. She has worked with a diverse array of underserved communities. Monique works as a missionary to South Africa for over 4 years, serving children and teachers impacted by drugs, violence, and trauma. Monique spent 2 decades advocating for critical race theory, but through a series of events began to see the contradictions of CRT with the historic Christian worldview. She is now convinced that CRT is not the best way to achieve racial unity, and actively speaks out against the use of CRT within the church. Monique's vision is to promote a vision of racial healing based on the historic Christian worldview. Monique has a BA in sociology from Biola University. She is working on her MA, Masters of Arts in Theology. So I am glad that she is joining me. How you doing, Monique? How's everything with you?
I am good, doing well. How are you?
Doing well. Glad you joined me on this one. This is going to be a good one because this is an area of thought that hits at center. You know, you and I were speaking before the show, and we both grew up in LA, relatively close, a small world, pretty close to each other, actually. Around the corner, and it's and so we both have our experiences, whether we knew it or not, whether we knew what CRT was or not, the academic aspect of CRT or not, we were actually introduced in some fashion or form to this overall understanding of CRT. So before we go into that, why don't you tell me exactly what is that? Give a rough explanation of what CRT is. What is that all about?
Well, I think in its truest form, CRT really is just an academic framework that looks at how racial injustice intersects with like law, and how are racial injustices upheld through things like white supremacy. How are, I think when you break it down on like a layman's term, how are white people maintaining racism and racial injustice, and how are people of color impacted by that? What are the results of what is now considered white supremacy? And so how is racism in every fabric of America? And how do white people uphold racism in every fabric of America? And what is the implication of that on people of color? So critical race theory is just a critical look into society, looking at injustice based on color when you break it all the way down.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. As I was saying, man, it seems as though, unbeknownst to myself or yourself, it seems that growing up in the black community, it seems as though I was introduced to it. You know, I was almost raised in a sense to have this outlook, and I'm raised in a church, right? I was raised in the church, grew up in the church, but that was not the outlook that I had as far as a biblical view of unity, a biblical view of a body of Christ. You know what I mean? Grew up in a church, all black church. So it was a very segregated type of body. And so just this idea of having to sort of readjust myself throughout my time growing up, maturing, and sort of readdressing myself to the more biblical perspective of what unity is and how we should deal with, I guess, oppression or injustices. You know, so what would you say to that? What are your thoughts about that?
I would agree. I didn't grow up in the church. I came into church and was saved around the age of 15, 16. But I spent my formative years in South LA. So until I was about 15, 16, I was in South LA, like I said, around the corner from you, like Slauson and Crenshaw, Slauson and Normandy. And CRT, what we consider CRT and the issues put forth by CRT was just common conversation. You know, I always say, like, one of the things that I remember is the conversation around the riots and asking why people were so angry and why people were rioting and breaking things. And my mother was like, because white people think that they can do black people in any kind of way. You know, that to me translates over into the more academic framework of, well, white people think that they can uphold white supremacy and allow for racial injustice in every facet or every fabric of America, or things like, you'll always have to do twice as good to, be able to match a white person. There's just this underlying idea of how black people participate and how white people participate. I think the academic idea of, participating and being twice as good is this idea of a glass ceiling. And so, just always having to match or meet these markers was part of the conversation there and growing up. And so, it was just, like I said, it was just on the street. It was there. It was common. And getting into Biola and studying sociology, now I had an academic framework. Now I had the statistics that backed it up, but it was never questioned. The data was never questioned. The data was just, this is the data and this is what it means and this is fact. And now we put Jesus on it. Yeah.
This idea of white supremacy, obviously, I think CRT collapses if white supremacy isn't true. So I guess I've had a bunch of conversations with my family members, with friends who I grew up with about white supremacy. I personally don't think white supremacy is real. I sometimes I think of it almost like a cloud, this cloud that's hovering over, almost like a myth in some ways of thinking about it. And I'm like, the only person that the only person that can really hold someone's back is your own performance. You know what I mean? How you interact with things, how you pursue things. God's grace is on it. I mean, if you have God, the grace of God is on your situation. He's on your struggle. He's on your everything you're trying to do. And in my mind, I'm like, all I did was just try to pursue where I'm going. You know what I mean? And here I am. So what is your position on white supremacy? What are your thoughts when it comes to that?
So the idea of white supremacy being that there is like racism in the structures that uphold this idea of whiteness, or that upholds white people in power structures and things like that. Could it be in some places? Sure. I think the hearts of man are wicked. Yeah. And in the wickedness, sure, you might get someone who is a racist. But I don't think that that threads out through all the fabric of America. I saw that someone posted this on your Facebook page, like ask her if she believes that America is, completely racist or, a racist country. And I don't believe that white supremacy is what is leading the charge in America. And but with that, to your point, I do believe that hard work plays out. Now, I can work hard and come across someone who is racist, and I can trust God that he's going to lead me where I need to be. And so in that, I feel like if I come across someone who is racist, if it's meant for me to be there, the Lord will open the door, and for all I know, he could work in this guy's heart, or the Lord will close the door and this person's racism may continue on. That's not necessarily for me to worry about all the time. That also doesn't mean that I condone racism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's just one of those areas where it could, I guess, possibly be there, I just don't see it, Monique. I just don't see it because in every area that I've worked in, I've served in the Navy. I was in the Navy for 4.5 years. My mom was a single mother, raised both her boys, in LA. So it's like all these obstacles that could have been attributed to, I guess, white supremacy, I guess to some degree. I just didn't see it. I'm just like, well, no, I just pursue.
Well, see, I think
I just don't see it.
It's important to thread through, though. Are we looking at laws? Are we looking at, individuals? How are we defining white supremacy? If we're talking about, that the idea of white supremacy is threaded through every piece of the American fabric, I say no. That's just not true anymore. We can look at laws. We can look at things that have been overturned. Now, can I come across somebody who might be racist? Sure. And I trust God with that. But when we look at, is America a racist nation? Are we completely filled in and out with racist systems? I would say no. I would say we don't have the proof of that. I would actually say that I would extend that to say we actually have proof to prove otherwise. That it's not, that as a Black woman, I can go and pursue any career that I want to pursue. I can go and use my voice. We can have this conversation despite our color.
Yeah. And I think a part of it is it almost seems like they're when we have people on the CRT side or on the BLMs, you know what I mean, these Marxist groups, and when they speak in a tone as if has there been no improvement, as if there'd been no improvement. If you listen to BLMs, the BLMs of the world, you would almost think that we're still living in Jim Crow days, Jim Crow and slaves back in the slavery days, you know what I mean? So it almost seems like they're not recognizing the advancements that we have made throughout our country in these areas of racism. Nobody denies that there was racism. Nobody denies that there was this level of hatred simply by the color of my skin. You know what I mean? But there seems to be this idea that, or that's implied at least, that there has been no advancement when there's clearly have been advancements to make it better. And so
to me, it's all or nothing.
Yeah. So in my head, whenever I'm conversing with someone who holds these positions, I try to convey the message like, yeah, we went through those things, and I'm thankful for my ancestors who went through these things. And I'm thankful for them striving through the battle so that the Black community today has this opportunity to strive forward from their struggle, from their oppression that they were able to raise up out of. And so whenever I hear someone of that position saying, oh man, white supremacy, we're all oppressed, Black people are oppressed, everyone of color is oppressed, I'm like, maybe sometimes, but the majority of the time, no. I just don't see it. I just don't see it. Yeah. So
no, I agree. I agree. I think it's a all or nothing with some people who uphold BLM. It's like, if there is one small injustice anywhere, then everything is now white supremacy. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily a true injustice. It can be something that they disagree with in their opinion. If their opinion forms the thought that it is an injustice, now we are all, oppressed. We are all experiencing injustice. And that message needs to be, spread far and wide. But I also think that this goes along with some of the critical race theory, the way it's played out currently, some of that narrative of completely undermining the system, overturning the system. What does that do to Black people? Exactly. What does a complete overhauling of a system do to people, especially people who are, living in lower income areas, one, but two, what does this conversation do to identity? What does it do to individuality? There's so many things that I don't think people are considering within the Black community when we have these conversations on critical race theory.
Yeah, and one area that I find that is prominent also is the idea of the Black community having the ability to be racist, or the ability to the area of responsibility. Being responsible in a sense of being responsible for their actions. You know what I mean? And when I say this with the understanding of that, because the understanding of the oppressed versus the oppressor. You know what I mean? This idea that, okay, since I'm oppressed, I'm allowed to say certain things because I'm oppressed. No, you're not. You still have the responsibility to treat people because they're made in the image of God. They're imago Dei, right? They're made in the image of God, and they deserve your respect. They deserve your care. They deserve your love. And because you have this idea that you are a part of the oppressed group, does not mean that you can just say whatever you want to say. Because I've had a lot of folks, once again, come to me and say, well, Black people cannot be racist because we're not the oppressed. We don't have the money. We don't have the advantages to be able to implement structure that oppresses. And I'm like, no way. I mean, if we're under the law of God, right? The law of God, the authority, the objective standard of God, then everybody's responsible for what they do.
Yes.
Yeah. So
but blame takes away responsibility. Indeed. So when I blame someone, I now have no responsibility. It all shifts to this other person, and I can validate all of my actions because I have no responsibility to be able to participate in that. And so now it's all your fault. And to the conversation of like, well, Black people can't be racist, I think only Kendi probably holds to some other view of that. But this idea that we can't be racist, so we can't be racist because of like the power component. I can now participate in any way because it's not technically the true definition of racism because I don't have the power to back that up. And, I was reading Kendi earlier today for something else, and he talks about discrimination and says that, it's okay to discriminate if it breeds equity. If the discrimination itself then creates an equitable solution, then it's okay. So I can discriminate against white people as long as it brings about equity for all people. And I don't think he would agree with this, like, can we then discriminate against Black people as long as it brings about the equity of all people? This is not God's system. Like, God issues justice impartially. He does not say, well, you can be unjust to one group as long as it brings about justice for another group. Yeah. That isn't his standard. Leviticus 19 says you don't, defer to the rich or, treat the poor unfavorably. We don't do that. And so, but when we adopt these things into a people group or into a culture, and I'm thinking of Black culture right now, then we do see this kind of like okaying of discrimination and racism and injustice toward a group of people.
Yeah, it's I don't even know how to explain it. It's difficult to try to pin down the primary issue of this. I mean, we know that is sin, but would you say that things like intersectionality is is true? Would you say that there's some truth to it? Is there any quality to this as it concerns the Black community having, I guess, multiple areas of oppression? You know what I mean? Women, bisexual women, lesbian women, Black. And what would you say? What would you say to that world, to that aspect?
Man, I don't know. Like, I think that if I were to say yes, I would have to say yes toward everyone. But this is what people don't want to acknowledge. So if a white person is discriminated, can they be discriminated because they are white and a woman? I feel like a white man is more discriminated against these days than a Black woman. A Black woman has a higher chance these days, with everyone wanting to promote this, idea of equity, has a better chance of getting a job than a white man. And so are we going to look at their intersections, or do we only look at the intersections of minority BIPOC people?
Yeah.
See, this is the issue that, to me, this current social justice narrative, the current critical race theory narrative, what they promote, it promotes an inequity, or not inequity, but it promotes like partiality and racism, where I'm now going to promote one over the other. Do I think that intersectionality is the true issue behind racism and issues like that in the Black community? No, I don't. I honestly don't. I would say that, can it be an issue? Can someone discriminate against me because I'm a Black woman? Sure. Yes. But can someone discriminate against a man because he's a white man? Sure. These are more individual issues than, I would say, largely systemic issues. What I would say is truly problematic in the Black community is understanding responsibility, understanding choice, understanding a lot of the, like we talked about earlier, Black excellence, what that means, the role models we want to put forward, theology, like the issue of sin. Like, there's a lot of things that we can talk about in the Black community. If we want to talk about a Black agenda, we can talk about that all day long. But those things are not... I feel like they have less to do with this intersectional conversation as much as it does a personal responsibility conversation.
Yeah. And that, like, obviously part of that responsibility has to do with the fatherless homes, right? We got a 70%, I believe, of single mother homes, homes with no father in it. And that's an astounding number. Especially when you consider during slavery and during the time of Jim Crow, the family togetherness was much stronger back then. And we see in this time where we have many advances, we have many things that have been put in place in order to help the Black community, but yet the fatherless rate in these homes has skyrocketed. So
now I know. Yes. Keep going. Sorry.
It just doesn't correlate, because the dogma is that we are an oppressed people. And it seems as though if we're oppressed by this structure of white supremacy that's interwoven into the political, governmental systems that we live in, if that's the case, why do we see the family more together during when there was technically white supremacy, during Jim Crow and the days of slavery, than what we do now? It just doesn't follow for me. It doesn't follow, and it doesn't make any sense. What would you say to that, Monique?
I would say it doesn't make a lot of sense. To me, I attribute it to welfare and the welfare state. I think that before the welfare state, people had reason to stay together. People were definitely in it for something else. But outside of the welfare state, there's no reason to, or past the welfare state, there's no reason for people to get married. There's no reason to stay together. As a matter of fact, it's better if I didn't get married, because now, even though I might live with my boyfriend and we have these kids, technically I'm a single person and I can go and I can apply for this welfare. There are many reasons or benefits to not getting married these days. And I know people are going to be upset, and people will probably write you and me and talk about, well, that's not true, and, all of those things. But honestly, you can mark the institute of the welfare state and and blacks and minorities getting welfare, and also look at the rate of single parent homes and how they go up together. I want to say it was Thomas Sowell. It might not be Thomas Sowell, who did a whole documentary on it. There's research that has been done. I think that a lot of the policies that people put forward that say, well, you need more welfare because you're black, or you need more welfare because you're a single mom, or, all of these things, that isn't actually true. What we need is education. What we need is to be discipled. That's what we need. We need discipleship in the black community to say, hey, we don't do this. You are created in God's image. You have dignity, value, and worth. You don't need to be doing this, this, and this. We need to have classes on, how to be an entrepreneur. We need to get rid of the check cashing places in the black community. There's a lot of issues that are going on in the black community that we can talk about. But I think that a lot of it goes back to choice and to things that we are doing. Now, does that mean that there's, like I said before, no issues of racism? No. But a lot of this does stem down to how we are choosing to live out our lives.
Yeah, it does. And once again, we talk about this, we talk about the issues, we talk about all these issues, and I just find it very important. And I guess my question would be next is, where is the church involved in this? Because once again, I've heard the argument that the reason that the black community tends to lean on BLM, lean on these socialist structures, these, in some very real essence, are communist structures. The reason that the black community tends to vibe towards these areas of thought is because the church is not involved enough, and particularly the black church is not involved enough in this. I was talking to you earlier about how the church that I went to did not have a strong theological aspect. They did not have a strong theological foundation, and I think that's a part of it. We live in a society where people go through things, people struggle. We do have areas of police brutality. We do have these areas, but where is the church at? Why is the church not stepping in these areas instead of a BLM? You know what I mean?
I don't know where I'm praying. One of the things that I think is interesting is that if you listen to like the word on the street, like we were talking about earlier, and the word in the church, the black church, a lot of times it's the same information. And I've started to wonder, is the church's information now seeping out into the street? And looking at things like James Cone and Black liberation theology, a lot of the Black liberation theology is mixed in with today's mainstream black church information, sermons about white people and the whiteness or the white devil, and how we interact with white people, the message of oppression, the message of reconciliation, and when it is or is not possible. That's a lot of Black liberation theology that to me has come down through the years and still remains in the church today. One, two, looking at LA, you get a church on every corner.
Yeah.
Especially in South LA. And they have like 10 people in them. Or they're, boarded up and have no one, and, no one's going there. I don't know where many of the prominent Black pastors are in this. Yeah. Like in LA, you have West Angeles Church, you have Faithful Central, and there used to be another one, but I'm not even sure if that one's in existence anymore. But, growing up, or you had like Fred Price's church and things like that. But there were 3 or 4 prominent churches, but still it felt like, or it seems like those pastors dealt within their own church sphere, but I never saw them really out in the community. And maybe I missed it, but looking now, I don't see them out in the community. I don't see them, educating. I don't see them speaking out against Black abortion. I don't see them speaking out against Black welfare. I don't know where that conversation is. And even when we look, on a more national level, I still don't see Black leaders, who are pastors speaking into this area as having a distinct voice in biblical unity.
Yeah, like you said, it's a church on every corner. It seems like all the churches have different theological, different positions, and I think this is where we get to the area of theology, understanding how all these churches need to be connected theologically, and I think that would help the churches in these communities to be able to stand up and say, okay, we're going together to help this area of issue. And like you pointed out, the area of abortion, Margaret Sager, the thought, the mind behind Planned Parenthood, a racist eugenist who purposely put these abortion mills in lower income urban communities in order to eliminate Black people, specifically to eliminate Black people. And it would seem to me, and this is where we get into the understanding of like people seem to not be educated in these areas. And this is what frustrates me. This is what frustrates me the most, Monique, is that we'll have people stand up, hoop and holler, emotional and all, about police brutality. Okay? But then when we get to the area of talking about why is the Black community practically number one in abortions, they contribute, they're not even the highest amount of population-wide percentage. We're not even in the highest, and yet we contribute to pretty much the most abortions out of all the demographics.
Yes, we are the highest.
Yeah, where is the outcry of that? Where's the outcry?
I think that there is a narrative that many Black communities have bought into from leaders like BLM or movements like BLM that tells us what the issues are. And if you veer from that, then you get shunned. Nobody wants to be shunned. So, I'm going to jump on with police brutality. Of course, it's everywhere. Now, statistically, is that true? It's not everywhere. But you know what is everywhere? Abortion is everywhere.
Yeah.
We are 4 or 5, Black women make up 4 or 5% of or birthing Black women within the country of, birthing age within the country make up like maybe 4 or 5% of the population, but we are responsible for the majority of abortions.
Yeah.
Something like 30 to 40%, 35, 40%, something like that. Like we are a huge contributor to abortions, and no one is highlighting that. And that should be coming from our pastors. That should be coming from the church. The church should be the one leading these conversations because it's impacting our communities.
Yeah, definitely. And, that's why it's hard for me to take people serious. It's hard for me to take people when they come to me and say, Marla, police brutality, racism is the number one thing we should be fighting against. I'm like, really? I mean, have you looked at the statistics? Have you looked at the numbers and see if that is the number one? And this is not me saying that racism doesn't happen. This is me saying that racism is probably not the most important thing to attack, and I think this is a construct of the whole CRT thing. I think this is a construct of feminism. This idea that women are empowered and they can do what they want to do with their own bodies. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm all down with females doing a thing, but does that mean that you have the right to kill a baby in the womb? No. And I think that, and that's where I think that the rubber hits the road there. What are your thoughts there?
I do agree. I think that, first wave feminism preceded the idea of critical race theory. And you do see a lot of feminism inside of critical race theory, in my personal opinion, looking at feminist theology or feminist, like critical feminism today. It is the idea that I can do what I want with my body. But again, like that isn't scriptural. That isn't biblical. And so how do we have that conversation within the Black community? I am still responsible for my actions. And if I am having an abortion, I am committing sin. Like, that's a sin. That's murder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no one is, to me, no one is having that conversation.
Yeah. And it's a conversation that needs to be held in the Black church, man. And every time I talk to a Black pastor about these type of subjects, they sort of don't want to talk about it. You know, they don't want to converse about these things, you know. And this is an area where we really need to focus in on as a church. We really do need to focus in on and try to minimize this stuff, because it's damaging to the Black community. Last time I checked, since 1973, we've had, in the Black community, we've had 15.5 million abortions, I believe, within the Black community since 1973. And that is the number one killer of the Black community, is abortion. And the fact that we don't hear anything from the Black churches as a whole concerning these areas is deeply concerning, and definitely needs some attention drawn there.
It's concerning that, you know, we've been 13% for decades. We're the only people group who aren't growing in population. And we're not growing not because of white supremacy and not because of police brutality. We are not being plucked off at that high of a number, but we are killing our own.
Yeah. Yeah, and you also want to get into Black on Black crime, you know, within the Black community, things like that. So that's an attribute to it as well. So these are major areas where I think CRT sort of muddies the water or clouds the proper perspective of the Black community to say, what areas do we need to focus on? Is there really an oppressed group, or is there individual responsibility for everyone, to where if that individual is a racist, yeah, he needs to be talked to, he needs to be rejected, he needs to be handled. But if the next person is not a racist, whether he's white, Black, Hispanic, yellow, red, I don't care. If he's not a racist, then let's not attribute racism to him because he's white. You know, it's just mind-blowing. So I do think that CRT clouds the water, muddies the vision, and distracts us from what's most important.
Well, this is what I was hinting on earlier, this whole idea of individuality, or me being an individual. Like, CRT breaks us down into our tribal groups. And so as long as I'm in my tribal group, I must think and be a part of the tribal group. And that's true for white people and Black people. And we won't even get into the Black-white binary. But you know, all white people must be racist because they belong to this group. And because of how this group is defined according to CRT, or, you know, social justice warriors, or how, you know, whoever, they are this way across all space and all time. And because I am Black, I am this way across all space and all time. Now, when I veer from the narrative, what does that mean for me as a Black woman? I am no longer a part of this, but where do I go? Because I'm not white. So now you're shunned by this group. You're condemned. You're called a coon. You're called, you know, all of these things. But the idea that I have been uniquely created in the image of God goes away because I am now attached to my tribal group, and I must be seen according to my tribal group, and I must see others according to their tribal group. And that takes away, to me, the conversation of individuality and responsibility as well.
Yeah. And then we flow to the area of thought where you have whiteness, or you have this idea, not whiteness, but you have this internalized oppression, or from a perspective of a white person, it will be considered someone who becomes woke and realizes that they are inherently racist. And whenever I've came across maybe 1, 2, or 3 people that really had that mindset, you know, and they really thought like, yeah, man, I'm white, therefore I'm racist, you know, and my first thought is like, okay, boom, how's that helping the Black community by you saying that you're guilty for something you had zero to do with? You know, how's that helping the Black community? And it's not. I just recently had a conversation again with someone concerning this very subject about should white folks be apologizing to black people for the oppression of their assumed ancestors, and I'm like, no. But this individual I was talking to was like, well, I don't see a problem with it. I don't see a problem with it, and it's just mind blowing because I don't think that helps the black community. I don't think it does at all. Not in one iota, not in one token does that the black community.
It doesn't help. To me, it also damages, because at that point, then, okay, so you apologize, but now what? Now, where else does that lead you to? Now I need to do this. Now I need to do that. Please stop helping us. Jason Riley wrote a book called Please Stop Helping Us. And I love that book because it actually talks about like the white liberal, so to speak, and what their help can often mean to the black community. You're constantly apologizing. You're constantly catering. Like, there's no need to coddle me just because I'm black. And I also feel like, well, what level of pride are you dealing with that you kind of think that you, in some ways, are admitting that you think you're better than me? But that's a whole nother conversation. There's just a way of thinking about black people and the black community that does not serve many black people, because it usually ends up in more social programs. It ends up in, conversations of reparations or things like that. And I'm like, that one is it's not necessarily biblical or godly. And two, it doesn't help us in being responsible, owning our own stuff and the places where we have sinned and gone wrong and need to step up.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned reparations. So, okay.
Oh my goodness.
All right. So I have taken a position that I say, well, reparations may not be a bad thing. I'm not necessarily 100% opposed to reparation. But at the same time, I do see the inconsistencies. If we're saying that it doesn't help the black community, then why would reparations help the black community? You know what I mean? Like, why, biblically speaking and culturally speaking, why would reparations help the black community? So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm sort of in between. I really don't have, I guess, a problem with it per se, but at the same time, I do see a possible harm that could come from it. So why don't you speak to that a little bit, Monique? What would you say there?
Do you want to pay me reparations? Because black people own black people. I don't want to give you my $5. I do not want to pay nobody my $5. I need that. Now, if you want to give me gas money, you got $5 to put on it, we can talk. But I'm just like, it doesn't make sense. So you're going to require white people to pay reparations. Does every white person's lineage go back to slavery? How are you going to thread that through? Are you doing it just based on skin color now? What about the people who, came over after, slavery was done? And what do you do with the black people who owned other slaves? Yeah, that's, I just kind of feel like, one, they don't have a strong structure for how they would, dish out these reparations. One, two, if we're going to be consistent, then anyone who was responsible for owning someone should then be participating in reparations. I don't know if I was on the lineage of the owning side, but I don't want to pay nobody.
Yeah.
And I also don't see a biblical precedent for it in the New Testament. So I don't, we're not under, the Old Testament, even though we do get our moral code and we can look in the moral law for how we treat one another. We're under the New Covenant. And in the New Covenant, I don't see that precedent being put forward for, accountability or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a convoluted issue, and once again, CRT likes to focus in on what happened with the transatlantic slave trade, right? They like to focus in on the Americanized understanding of slavery, and I like to think that if we were to broaden our understanding, and you mentioned it just now, black people own black people. Black people owned slaves as well. And in fact, it wasn't some European that was selling the slaves to the Europeans that came over here. It was black people selling black folks over to the European owners that we saw during the 1700s and 1800s. You know what I mean? So it's not something that is rooted in whiteness. It's not something that is at the core of everything that's rooted in white people. It is something that's actually rooted beyond that. You know what I mean? Yes. And I just wish that folks will come to that understanding, would dare dive into those areas of history, please. And I think that would be extremely helpful.
Chattel slavery is the end and be all of a lot of these conversations. It almost, drives in a narrative that slavery didn't exist until chattel slavery. But we see slavery in Genesis. It's a condition of man's heart. It's the reality of living in a post-fall world. One, two, we never look at, the Arab slave trade and what happened with black people who were taken from Africa and taken the other way, and the horrific atrocities that went that way. We also don't look at, the Africans that only made it, to South America, and the booming slave trade that was South America. There are many conversations, but I think that, in our unique context, people put forward the idea of chattel slavery as being the worst. Now, I'm not a proponent of slavery at all. Please don't hear that. But we also have to be able to thread these conversations out and say, okay, this is what happened here. And yes, it's unique in some ways, but then, there was also this, and it was way worse here. What does that mean for us in our context?
Yeah, and the outrage needs to be pointed in all directions. Like you mentioned, the Arab countries, like currently, even today, we see black folks being enslaved by Arabs. And they go so far as to castrate, they castrate the males, and it's just deplorable. And it's not only is the idea of chattel slavery and this type of slaveries deplorable, but what's even more disappointing is that, the black community will not dive into these areas. Let's dive into these areas. Let's see what the truth is. Let's look at the history behind this stuff so that we can come to a proper understanding of what happened during slavery. Let's look into these areas of thought. And then let's take a step back from that study and let's apply it biblically. Let's see what the Bible says about this so we can have a proper understanding of how to apply a justice, or how to help the oppressed, how to come as a people, as a body, and address these areas of concern. If the area of concern is the black community has a lower income rate, just for example, if they have a lower income rate, well, let's try to help these areas because. Okay, so the transition from the times of Jim Crow, the transition from the time of slavery, yes, the black community has some areas of catching up to do. They certainly do. You have Black Wall Street that got burnt down, that got destroyed. We have some areas to catch up to, and that's a fact. That's just true, right? But instead of saying that our major problem is, according to CRT or according to BLM, is police brutality, let's look at the real issues. Let's deal with the real issues. And I think if we deal with the real issues, we'll see that we're not doing as bad as people might think, according to CRT or BLM. You know what I mean?
Yeah. One of the things that I appreciate about CRT is that it has brought an awareness that there are problems. Now, to me, it highlights the wrong problems, but there are problems. And I think before CRT truly came on scene, we weren't necessarily looking at the problems. And so it's kind of like you're saying, like, yes, there are problems. We need to be looking at the problems, but we need to be looking at the problems from a statistical reality. We need to be looking at the problems from a biblical reality first and foremost. When we talk about things like justice and oppression, we need to be able to define those things biblically, because if we don't define them biblically, then we're going to be looking at anything and everything that culture may tell me is an injustice or, some kind of oppressive issue. That's not always true. But if we don't within the Black community say, look, we have some issues. Let's truly lay out what these issues are. And if we want to put police brutality on there, sure, put police brutality on the list. Then go through the list and be like, look, okay, this is really what's here. Mm-hmm. Now, how do we deal with these issues? I think that people would be hard pressed to say that police brutality is one of those, 1 to 10 issues or 1 to 5 issues. I don't think so. I think the issues that we're talking about, things that truly are inhibiting the Black community, are the things that we've already talked about. Black on Black crime, abortion, drugs, education, responsibility, like fatherless homes, the Black church, places where truly we do have opportunity to speak into.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just important for us to be able to have the courage to speak into those. I think a lot of the reason that people do not speak into it has everything to do with a lot of courage, having courage to do so. Because if you were, as a Black man or Black woman, if you were to step out of the culture and say, well, the number one problem is not white supremacy, it's fatherless homes. Now, what you done stepped out the cultural norm. Now you start getting terms thrown at you like coon, Oreo, coconut, whatever it is. Yep. You know what I mean? You get all these terms thrown at you that are unjustified. You know what I mean? Because because you're trying to look at the situation for what it really is, but now you get thrown under the bus and call all these terms. So I think there takes a level of courage to be willing to step out of the norm, out of the cultural norm, and say, this is where the problem is. This is where the areas of struggle is, and we need to hit this headstrong. What are your thoughts?
I agree. It does take a level of courage, because you are going to get shunned. You are going to get kicked out of the tribe. And right now, me personally, feel like I'm being kicked out on both sides. So, like the Black community will be like, she a coon, she, just denying racism and all that. And I'm not denying racism. I think that it's an issue of the human heart. I think it'll always be there. But then I get, mainly white women who will, who are woke, and the social justice warriors who tell me, well, you're just racist against your own people. You're just allowing white women, to perpetuate their whiteness and, continue in their racism and to continue to be complicit in their racism. It's a lonely road to choose to use your voice in a way that goes opposite of culture.
Certainly. And like it's some ways to go, right? It's some ways to go to be able to stand strong in these areas. And that's where our understanding of Christ comes into play, right? That's where our understanding and foundation of Christ comes into play. And so when we talk about justice, there's a couple verses that I want to introduce. And I have these verses here. I'm going to pop them up on the screen. And let's talk about justice a little bit. Let's see what the Bible says about justice. So I have Micah 6:8. It says, he has told you, mortal one, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So this is obviously God exhorting and telling us, hey, he loves justice. He desires justice. You know what I mean? And as a people, as a body of Christ, as believers, we are to, be instruments in carrying out justice or carrying out to draw somebody out of that area of oppression. So it's not this idea that the Bible is against justice. The Bible is obviously very declarative about putting down justice, but it's with the right biblical framework that we need to do that. And I don't think BLM is that framework that we need to be gleaning from in order to properly implement justice. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. When I hear this verse, the first thing I tend to think of, and it took me a long time to get here, but how do you define justice? So we're given the command to do justice. Now, most people take this and they run with it, and they're like, well, you need to be doing justice. Well, have you read, Micah 1? Do you know why this command was even given? Do you know the issues that were that the people were facing that even made the Lord say, do justice? How do you define justice? If you are just running with a scripture that says do justice, but you're taking your cue from culture as to what justice is, you're going to be in a hot mess of a situation, because you are going to define justice as something that you might believe is holy, but truly is antithetical to scripture. We have to look into the law and get the definition of justice and understand, how do we do justice? Right now, culture's definition and what culture is putting forward as justice is truly unjust. It's partiality. We don't participate that way. So to say, hey, I need to do justice, well, if you don't know what justice is, you can't come at me with that scripture.
Exactly. I have another verse here. I think this points to it as well. But let justice roll like waters, and righteousness like an evening flowing stream. That's Amos 5:24. Once again, we see this repetitiveness of God loving justice. He desires justice, and that's righteousness, right? That's that righteousness to let that nobody wants anybody cheated. Nobody wants anybody killed unjustly. Nobody wants any harm done to anyone unjustly. And hence we get the outrage of the George Floyd situation. So when we look at situations like that, we're outraged. I was outraged, like, whoa, you know what I mean? Pinned on this man's neck for 9 minutes, so there is a level of outrage that we are to have when we see injustices happening. But the only problem is that sometimes I do feel that the church doesn't step in enough to take that position. The objective standard of justice that we have is from the Lord. He gives us that standard of what justice is, and what other people should be stepping in than the body of Christ, who has the objective standard of what justice is.
Yes, we serve a God he himself is just. And we should be the most outraged at injustice, because our God is just. But we should also not be surprised when we see injustice, because the world does not serve a God who is just. And we can't take our cues from the world, because they truly don't have a definition as to what justice is. They don't truly have a foot to stand on to talk about justice if they aren't serving God, because God is just. He is the true definition. He sets forward the definition of what justice is. They might have an opinion of what they think can be right or wrong, but they don't truly have a framework to be able to say this is why, because they aren't serving a God who is just. If you are a secular humanist, if you are, an atheist, agnostic, if you don't truly uphold God, what is your framework or foundation for claiming that justice is needed and necessary?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. That's great. And we were talking about apologetics before we jumped on here. Yeah, I mean, that's where it's at, right? I mean, if your understanding of morality or justice is skewed, and it's skewed by this culture, there's no way you can have a proper understanding of what justice is. There's no way you can apply it correctly. Because if we're going off the cultural understanding of justice, everyone in every household has their own understanding of what justice is.
Yes.
So
this is why Ibram Kendi can say it's cool to discriminate in order to get justice, because he doesn't have a framework. He doesn't have a true framework.
Yeah, and that's it right there. that is it right there. And it's once again, it's just one of those things we as a body, we have to dive into. We have to continue to work towards. We have to continue to do great work in these areas of thought. And when and doing whatever we can to draw the Black community out of this nonsense dogma of out of this area of thought that says that there are two groups, this tribal stuff, like you mentioned earlier. We have to do what we can to try to draw a lot of the black community out of this area of thought, and make sure that those black communities, those individuals in the black community that we're able to preach the gospel to, tell them about the love of Christ, and draw them and bring them into a relationship with Christ, we are to disciple them, you know. And I think from that point, we'll be able to, that's where the work starts, you know what I mean, to be able to give a good foundation for many in the black community. So I think
agree
that's where
completely.
we need to go.
I do. I agree. You know, true discipleship will lead people away from so many of the issues that are problematic within the black community, one, but it will also lead people away from this tribal mentality, because they will be discipled into Ephesians 4 that lets them, or not just Ephesians 4, but into Ephesians as a whole, that talks about the oneness that we have as brothers and sisters in the body, being adopted into God's family. True discipleship will lead us into unity.
Yeah. Definitely. But that's all, Monique, man. I mean, I'm gonna close this thing out. But I thank you, Monique, for coming on The Gospel Truth. It was a fantastic time, a great time.
Thanks.
And I think we should do this again. I plan on getting.
You let me know.
Yeah, for sure. I want to get Neil Shanvey back on, and perhaps we can do both of you guys coming on with Neil Shanvey, or maybe three of you, Dr. George Yancey, Neil Shanvey, and yourself. I think that'd be a great show. So thank you, Monique. Thank you so much, Monique, for the work you're doing. Keep doing your thing. And I tell this to all my guests that I'm praying for you. I'm praying for your ministry. And don't stop. You know, no matter what's going on, don't stop. Keep doing your thing. All right.
Thank you. You too.
All right. God bless you. Take care.
God bless you.
All right, folks. Another great discussion. And this is one that I really enjoy, right? Because this sort of hits home. It definitely hits home to where we're able to dig into these areas. You know what I mean? And this show was obviously about try to focus in on a black community, right? And this show was not about to say, oh, white folks, you stay out of this. We're trying to come together and illustrate or give an understanding of what exactly the black community is dealing with. So not only can black folks obviously help the black community, but white folks can too. You know, we could come together on this as a body of Christ and be able to dig into these areas to be able to help these areas that are prominent issues, that are prominent areas where we need to work in. And I thank Monique for her ministry. I thank her for the work she's doing and the effort she's putting forth in order to do that, to work within a black community, work in these areas of struggle, to work in these areas of oppression, and preach the gospel, tell them about the love of Christ, and focusing on the areas that are really the center of our issues. So I really thank Monique for doing her thing. Keep doing your thing, Monique, once again. May God bless you. And may God keep you on that. But that said, I do want to go ahead and encourage you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Don't leave this channel without subscribing, should I say, to this show. Once again, we have a whole bunch of shows coming up here in the future, and I don't want you to miss any of them. Please don't miss any of the shows. All right. And that's it. I'm going to get out of here. May God bless you and may God keep you. Gone.